Hey, it's Michael, and I've got a question for you. Where do your values come from? Welcome to the follow up question. I'm your host, Michael Ashford. Come with me on a journey as I explore how we communicate well. What we have been taught about communication and what has been modeled and incentivized through our culture has left us in a place where we know how to exert our ideas and opinions and beliefs onto each other, but we miss the other half of conversation, the extraction. My aim with this show is to bring you perspectives and ways of looking at issues or topics that perhaps you haven't considered before. To teach you how to ask curious questions, how to seek understanding over certainty, and how to listen and give space so that ultimately you might become a better communicator. I'm a former journalist who believes everyone has a story to tell, and it's only when we ask questions and listen that we reveal what connects us as humans. Our dreams, our desires, our experiences, our ideas, and what we stand for, rather than what we are against. Just before I pushed the record button to start recording this intro, what was I thinking about? Now, you might assume that I was thinking about what I was going to say right here in this moment, which is becoming intensely more meta for me the more I talk about it. But honestly, how can you be sure? The truth is, you can't be sure. You'll never know with 100% certainty what was going through my head, even when I tell you that I was actually thinking about the steak that I'm going to have at dinner tonight as my wife and I celebrate my birthday. It's from my favorite place in town here in Denver, and I can't wait. Now, you can assume that that's true, but do you really know? My guest in this episode says that psychology tells us that you assume what I just told you to be true based on little evidence to the contrary. Why else would you have any reason to believe that I was thinking about anything other than a steak? And in fact, you actually make these kinds of assumptions with most people about most things. You assume the things they're telling you are true. In this episode, I speak with Dr. Kurt Gray, a professor of psychology and neuroscience at the University of North Carolina, and the director of the Deepest Beliefs Lab, as well as the Center for the Science of Moral Understanding. I came across Kurt's work when I watched his TEDx Talk, What Am I Thinking?, where he illustrates just how hard it is to know what's in another person's mind, and in turn, what might be true for them. It's called the problem with other minds, and it is a major stumbling block when it comes to the things we value, our morals as individuals, and our ability to communicate across disagreements and divides. What is true? Where do these morals and values come from? Is there anything we can be certain of when dealing with other humans? What is our primary goal as interrelational humans? Well, one can assume you're about to hear the answers to these questions and more if you just keep listening. You led off one of your TEDx talks with one of my favorite things, which was you asked a question of the audience, which was, "What am I thinking?" as a way to kind of get them in the mood and the mindset of understanding how difficult it is to understand people's thoughts. My question to you as we kick things off here, Kurt, is what are you thinking about right now? What is top of mind for you? I love that as a jumping off point. Let's go there.
Uh, I mean, what I'm thinking about right now is I'm thinking about the example that I use in that TEDx talk, which was about chasing the wheel of cheese down the hill. And so you just prime me to think of that. So right now I'm thinking of chasing a wheel of cheese down a hill, which still illustrates the point that, if people hadn't seen that talk, they would have no idea why I would be thinking what I'm thinking. And it still reveals that it's hard to know what other people are thinking.
Had you thought about that since that talk?
I, I had not. No, not at all. It's not something I think about at night.
Well, as it relates to your work, let's jump there. You're the director of the Deepest Beliefs Lab and the Center for the Science of Moral Understanding. What in your work occupies your mind these days?
So the part, well, a couple things occupy my mind. One, I just finished a book, so I am trying not to think of that anymore because I've thought of it for 18 months. But that book is really about the focus of my work in the center, which is about how to get people to talk to each other across divides, how to get liberals and conservatives and other people who disagree about morality to not be nasty to each other, basically.
How did you get how did that become something that you were interested in?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I guess I wasn't really truly interested in politics. So I didn't come through it from political science. I more came from it from what I've studied before, which is about the problem of other minds and how we can't know what other people are thinking. And so when it comes to politics and to speaking across divides, I think people assume that those on the other side have evil inside their minds, lack some fundamental moral sense, and that's why they have difficulty agreeing with them or even talking with them. But of course, those are all assumptions we make about the minds of others. And so I was interested in how can we document those pernicious assumptions about the minds of others, and then hopefully how can we correct those and get people to talk to each other. And I should say, it's not just about politics, right? Like if you're disagreeing with your partner or your best friend or about anything, right? There's this disconnect between what's in your mind and what's in the other person's mind that drives our conflict.
And I certainly want to get into bridging that gap, but going back to a phrase you just used, the problem of other minds. Can you explain what that means?
Yeah, yeah. A little inside baseball. So it's an old philosophical concept about how your mind you take for granted, right? You obviously know you have a mind. You are a mind, some might say. You're the sum collection of your thoughts and your feelings, your opinions, your desires. But what is so obvious to you is fundamentally opaque or off limits to other people, right? Like, I have no idea looking at your face right now whether you have feelings. I just don't know. Like, you're smiling. Maybe you're smiling because you're wondering how I might taste with a Chianti if you chopped me up and boiled me, right? I don't know. And that's the problem of other minds, because you can not know what's in the minds of other people. You don't know if they're capable of feeling pain or feeling pleasure, or if your blue is the same as my blue. Perhaps it's yellow. Do strawberries taste the same to me as to you? And so for all these reasons, it's hard to understand what's happening in other people's minds. And we erroneously assume oftentimes that people have bad feelings or evil expectations of us. And for that reason, right, conflict can spring up in all sorts of places.
How does that not become uh, all-consuming? In the work that you do, Kurt, how does that idea that I could never truly know if you're listening to me, I can never truly know what you're seeing, what you're thinking, how does that not become all-consuming? Or maybe it has, I don't know, you tell me.
Well, I guess there's a philosophical issue, which if you sit there thinking of it, right, like if you're high or something, you're just like, oh my God, right, how can it be the case? But most of the time, we're not sitting there reflecting high. We are trying to live our lives. And so we make pragmatic, sacrifices just to live our lives. So I generally assume that when people are smiling, they're happy and they're not, cannibals, for instance.
I'm not, for the
Right?
record.
You don't know. That's the problem with other minds.
Right?
Um, and so we just make these assumptions, right? Just to, like, the social lubrication of our lives in some sense, right? Like, I assume if someone tells me something, they're telling me the truth. The only time it really pops up is when you're dealing with kids, I think, because their minds are different from yours, and they make all sorts of assumptions about the minds of other people's that are faulty, right? They think that other people know their own minds and they don't. But for most adults, it's just an easy thing to just assume that they're reasonable, rational people who have similar kinds of thoughts. But it's a good question.
What you just said there, the assumption that what someone says is they're telling you the truth. Why do we default there? What's the story with that? Is that true that we default to believing what people tell us is true?
Yeah, I mean, this is a deep rabbit hole. If we want to talk about other minds and truth, but we generally assume the truth of any proposition we encounter, uh, because our minds when they understand the world, they say like there is an X, and only after we assume that can we negate that. So I'll give you an example. Um, I have never had intimate relations with a goat. To evaluate that proposition, you first need to say, well, what's the proposition? It's having intimate relations with a goat. And then you take a step back and be like, never, right? This is why, like attack ads for politicians and so forth, just by like saying something, even if they later say it's false, it will stick in your mind and you will imagine if it's true. And sometimes you think it's true. That's called a sleeper effect sometimes,
Hmm.
right? Even if you learn something that's false, the falsity falls away and you just remember the kind of truthiness of that proposition. It's just a quirk of our mind, right? That we first have to know something and then we say, well, that something's not true. And then, of course, interacting with everyday people, it's just easy to assume that people, if you thought that everything was a lie, you just sit there again high, like in the Matrix, being like, is anything true? Turtles all the way down. And so at some point, you just have to say, everything's probably as it seems. And it's easy to do that as an initial first assumption when interacting with the world.
And I want to get there because that everything is probably as it seems, I assume, is where we get into trouble down the road when conflict presents itself. But I do want to swing back. How did this become your focus in your work? How did you get wrapped up in this, what you described as a rabbit hole of the mind?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I mean, part of what social psychology reveals is that each of us are imperfect introspectors. And so I will give you a story right now, I'm sure. That story is more or less coherent. Is it the right story? I don't know. Is that actually how I became interested in this? Perhaps. Or am I just creating a fiction that stitches together the events and preferences of my life into something that seems to make sense for me right now? I think probably more of that than we might expect. Um, but I'll have a go anyways. And I actually think there's way more randomness in our lives than we often assume.
Hmm.
And so I don't even know if there is really a story beyond the fact that I don't like studying rocks, and that's where I started out in in college. I started out in geophysics. I did some exploration work close to the Arctic. It was cool. We did helicopters and snowmobiles, and it was like a 19-year-old's dream. But I realized I didn't care where natural gas was underneath the ground, and I'd rather be concerned with other mysteries of the mind. And so I bounced around majors a little bit, very briefly, and ultimately decided on psychology, which, what's more interesting than yourself? Right? This is why we have social media. Everyone loves posting about themselves. And so I was taken with kind of exploring my own assumptions of what I took for granted in the world. And I think also, even kids are interested in philosophy, but what I liked about social psychology is that you could take deep philosophical questions and apply the kind of standard experimental scientific method to them. And so my advisor, Daniel Wegner, he was the one who really studied these philosophical questions with psychology. He studied free will, he studied thought suppression, and he started studying mind perception when I came to work with him. And so he kind of got me interested in this vein. And particularly, I became interested in the link between mind perception and morality, because it's interesting to think about whether someone has a mind. Again, if you're stoned and you're sitting in a car, looking up at the stars. But I think it's important to know about mind perception if you're figuring out whether someone deserves moral rights or deserves to be executed for their deeds, right? Those are when questions of mind really matter for people and for society. And so what got me going about mind perception and the problem of other minds is ultimately the questions about morality that surround it.
You mentioned there in that story, social media. What has the emergence of social media over the last, I'll say, 20 years brought to your field? What effect has that had on the study of the mind?
It, in a boring way, in some sense, it provides just a new source of data, right? That's easy to get. So you can download a million tweets. We have papers where we've downloaded, millions of tweets, and we analyze them, and they give you an insight about how people approach the world. So one project, I don't know if you can see my cats up here. Speaking of other minds, does
Yes.
my cat have a mind? I'm not sure, but certainly less of a mind than I think sometimes. Um, and so social media allows an insight into kind of the social phenomena that we've always cared about, like how people understand threat. So we have a project right now on moral panics, and social media is a great place to watch that unfold because people panic about something every day. Great. But in another way, social media kind of reveals the kind of very limits of our social experience by supercharging the things we already knew people cared about, which is themselves and their groups of people and their social reputations. So I don't think it's changed who we are, but it's kind of unleashed some of our social phenomena in strange and sometimes unpleasant ways.
Those things that arise a panic in us that you just mentioned, um, to back it up, I guess the question that is rolling through my mind, Kurt, here is, do we know where morals come from? Like, do we understand the creation of a moral undergirding of a particular issue?
I think we know fairly well. Again, the question of turtles all the way down. I was recently in a conversation with a philosopher, a Christian philosopher, and we were at an event and talking about objective morals, like moral objectivism. And so he was big on like, look, there is an objective moral truth. It's given by God, and even if we can know it imperfectly, it's still out there. And I'm a psychologist, and so my take is maybe there's an objective moral truth. Maybe it's just based off of suffering or protecting people or some kind of virtues, but it's hard to know what that moral truth is. And so for my work, I just look at how we subjectively understand our morals and where those might come from in a kind of evolutionary sense. So I just want to put the question of objective morals aside in case there's any, folks listening who are like, yes, there's an objective moral truth. I'm not denying that, but it's kind of hard to know what it is. Um, and so I think the standard scientific explanation for how we get our moral judgments are when we, as humans in the midst of time, gather together to live in groups. And the reason we gather to live in groups is because we kind of suck as organisms, right? We're very vulnerable to predation from real predators, and so we have to band together to protect ourselves. Meerkats do it, right? Little monkeys do it. Humans do it too. We're primates, so we're all afraid. We're all living together to protect ourselves. Except when we live together, then now we can be harmed by other people who live with us. Be murdered by my neighbor. My neighbor can steal my food or steal my mate or something. And so we developed morality, a kind of code to help us live together. And societies that developed a moral code kind of could outcompete other societies that didn't have a moral code, because the ones that didn't descended into chaos and murdered each other and died out. Yeah. And so, in an ultimate sense, morality comes from the problems of living together in groups. More proximately, though, how do we get our moral judgments about abortion or taxes and so forth? And I think there are good explanations for how we get moral judgments about those things. And my work suggests that our kind of those moral judgments are ultimately about how we try to protect ourselves and those we care about from suffering harm. And to go back to the question about mind perception, right? We basically try to protect people from suffering, and only people with minds have the capacity to suffer. So ultimately, it's about protecting from harm people with minds. Yeah, which is why we care about helping people and maybe my cat, but not rocks and I don't know about lobsters.
Is that why it feels so dangerous to challenge our morality, our morals?
Because questions of harm are at the middle, you're thinking?
Because it feels like if we do so, from what I gather from your answer there, that it will harm those we love or that we care about.
Yes, yeah, and ourselves even.
Yeah.
So
We
I
all love
mean,
ourselves, I think, in some way, shape, or form.
yeah, well, I mean, self-preservation is like the most,
Yeah.
fundamental instinct of being alive. So I think it's obviously the case that we think that your neighbor shouldn't murder you and your family, and that if your neighbor does decide to do that, that would be threatening because of the direct harm it would cause. But even in the cases that we're arguing about in the world today that are less immediately about harm, people still ground those views in the kind of general sense of immediate harm. And so the example I like to use, it's a little old now, but I think it's perfect, is about gay marriage. And so when the vote at the Supreme Court was going on about gay marriage, there were a number of evangelical conservatives who thought that the failure to ban gay marriage was going to destroy America, and not in just a symbolic, like what are we all here for sense, but like literally, hurt children, like condemn our souls to eternal suffering. And there's a woman named Anita Bryant who's an outspoken critic of gay rights, and she thought that what would happen was that gay folks would kind of drive around, kids would see that it was like super fun to be gay, because let's be honest, they have a lot more disposable income, gay couples than couples with kids, because kids are expensive, right? So they're driving nice cars, they have snappy clothes, and then kids see how fun it is to be gay. They say, hey, like, Jimmy, you want to be gay with me so we can like have fancy clothes? And Jimmy says, of course. And then, there's like a dotted line here. It gets to like nuclear holocaust, basically, right? Like no one has kids anymore, inflation or whatever, right? Like the economy collapses and we're all destroyed. And I say it in a jest, but some people literally believe it's going to destroy children in America for this. And I think it's hard for people who don't share those morals to see that harm, but people who do see things like gay rights or whatever view of abortion or guns you have, to the other side will cause tangible harm to things you care about.
Just as an aside here, you've used the phrase twice, turtles all the way down. What does that come from? I am unfamiliar with that.
Oh, so in questions about cosmology, like the nature of the universe, the question is, well, upon what does the Earth sit? And so you've got the Earth, or maybe it's like, I don't know if it's like a flat Earth or something, but there's some legend, and now you press me on it. I'm not sure, like, exactly what it comes from, but it's like the Earth is on top of horses, and then it's on top of something else, and then it's on top of turtles, and then the question is, well, what are the turtles on? And well, some other turtles, and then it's just turtles all the way down, and so the idea is basically like, well, the universe, you can ask these questions at every level down, and the questions never end. So when it comes to minds, right? Like, do you have a mind? Does God have a mind? Right. And then usually, well, the buck can stop at God, but then sometimes if you think God's on a turtle, and then it spirals all the way down.
Gotcha. Yeah, I was unfamiliar with that phrase. So then, Kurt, how does taking a view of an issue, any of the issues that you've mentioned so far, what takes place in our life where that becomes, to use the lab that you direct, one of our deepest held beliefs? Like, it becomes more than just something we think to be true, but it becomes, in a sense, like our identity as a person, that we stand for this thing. How does that how does it get to that point?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, I mean, we kind of already talked about how a general belief or value becomes a moral value, right? So, there are literally hundreds of values that you could have in the world. Yeah.
Yeah.
And some of them we ascribe more to conservatives and some to liberals, libertarians. I don't think that there's real differences between the kind of values that liberals and conservatives care about. I think it's more of a question of when do different people make those values into moral values.
Mhm.
And the example I like to use is punctuality. So I generally don't care about being on time. I'm generally fine with being a few minutes late. My wife, not so fine. But we all agree that if I'm late to submit my daughter's college application and she doesn't get in anywhere, or if I'm delivering a heart transplant and I stop for a hamburger at Hardee's, right? That makes me a terrible human being. And so, what transforms a value to a moral value is about harm, right? And so if we see that it's causing harm, then whatever it is that value is, we think it's morally important. And so that makes it kind of like stronger in our hearts. We get more upset and outraged when people violate that value. But then you brought up the question of identity. And I think that's the second piece on this, right? And so we think that, there's lots of values that people care about. Murder, I think murder is wrong. I think theft is wrong. Like, we agree around the world about 99% of morality. Because we agree about 99% of the harms it causes.
Yeah.
But there are some issues, like abortion, where we disagree about the harm it causes. Is a fetus a baby, or is it a lump of cells? And now you've got this disagreement about harm, and that fires people up. And then it becomes salient about people's identity. You're on the red team, I'm on the blue team, or vice versa. And then we kind of like see the other side as evil, not just in general, but about this particular issue. And then the issue gets built up. So it's this kind of feedback cycle where the issue is important. Like, capital punishment is another thing that people care about. It's about diverging harms, but we don't really talk about it and care about it anymore because it's not like the team red and team blue right now. So I think identity is an important step as well.
One of the questions that I've been asking myself recently, as I've been on this podcast journey with this show, is when did I first voice the things that I care about? And what was the makeup of those? So, for instance, the first time I ever voiced my political stance, I grew up in red state Kansas with a very right-leaning conservative Republican family. The first time I can remember actually voicing my political opinions, it was a regurgitation of what I had heard all my life up to that point. And I was probably in my early teens when I said I was a Republican. And not saying that that in any way, shape, or form was wrong, or that I don't still believe some of those things today. But I've been going back and thinking, like, when did they actually become my beliefs? Are they actually my beliefs? And the question that I have for you, Kurt, is when do when do we begin to voice those things as if they were ours, or are our beliefs, are our moral understandings a makeup of something that has been passed down to us? Do any of us ever come to those beliefs on our own without doing some really tough work? I guess is the question that I'm asking.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I'm in a philosophical state of mind now because of our previous conversation. And so I think this question is ultimately, in some sense, about adulthood. Like when do we become responsible for what we think?
Yeah.
When are our thoughts our own, and when are we even morally responsible for the actions that we take? And I will give you a philosophical thought experiment, I think, to illustrate this, and it's called the Sorites paradox. And the question is if you have 10,000 grains of sand, is that a pile? Is that a pile?
Well, in my mind, I'm picturing what 10,000 grains of sand might look like, and probably not.
Okay, let's say a million grains of sand.
Yeah,
Right.
sure.
It's
I
yeah,
don't know where that
yeah,
dividing line is, but yeah, sure.
yeah. Right. And like 2 grains of sand is not a pile,
No.
right? But eventually, if you keep adding a grain to 2 grains, 3 grains, 4 grains, up to a million, it will somehow become a pile, even though there's no specific point. I think we can agree that is like the magic point from not a pile to a pile. And I think with our beliefs and our moral responsibility and our transition to adulthood, it's the same way.
Mm.
So you are given those beliefs from your upbringing naturally, because that's where things come from, our family and our culture. And I think we'd certainly say that a 60-year-old owns their beliefs. But does a teenager, does a college student, like you've given me, uh, you as a teenager is like the kind of like weird in between a pile and not a pile.
Yeah.
And so I think part of that question is about perception, you know, um, and if someone has extreme beliefs like Dylan Roof, right,
Mm-hmm.
the murderer, then we'd say, well, he owns those beliefs because he did something egregious. But someone who has like slightly different beliefs than their family, well, maybe we say maybe, or you're just reacting, right? Like these are questions of ownership that are really hard to disentangle, and I don't know if we ever can, in some sense.
What you just said there, that uncertainty of does it even make a difference for us to talk about morals and try to bridge gaps with people? Will it actually make a difference? Is that do you run into that uncertainty being an issue in the work that you do?
The question of whether we should even try to bridge moral divides.
Yes, because, and I forget how I kind of worded the question, but yes, because will it make a difference? Will it ultimately make a difference in if I deeply hold this belief about morality? What does bridging divides actually get us?
Yeah. So I think there's a distinction, and I think a lot of folks in this space, especially some kind of like right of center folks, are important to emphasize, which is that there is a difference between being willing to engage in civil discourse with other folks who have different moral positions and changing other people's moral positions.
Mhm.
So I think it makes sense that people should stick to their moral convictions in general, right? As long as they're not odious, right? And of course, it gets hard when people are at extremes. But for the most part, if you think that a late term abortion is immoral, and I think that's many people would agree with that position. And if you think that an abortion at 6 weeks, which you've only known about for 2 weeks, right? The way it works, and after a sexual assault, like is a reasonable. Many people think that's a reasonable opinion, right? So let's
Mhm.
restrict ourselves to kind of reasonable opinions as voted by most people. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think within that space, and again, I'm excluding people who are like, you know, I'm in the KKK, and so I think that
Yeah.
that these people don't deserve a seat at the table, right? I think
Yeah.
we can say those opinions, evil people, they do not deserve a seat at the table, and we need to have other strategies to deal with those folks typically. And I should say, I'm not in the KKK. I'm just imagining, right,
Yeah.
that someone saying that.
You're not in the KKK, and I am not a cannibal. We can stipulate that.
So let's consider only ourselves with positions that people think are generally reasonable. And within that space, I think it's important that people don't feel necessarily compelled to give up their moral convictions, even if they might be open to kind of some level of persuasion. And after all, like democracies are founded on a sense of pluralism, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like this kind of like competing values or finding the kind of common ground that we can agree on, right? Like that's the strength of democracy. So we should keep these different opinions. But democracies also require in a pluralistic society that we have civil engagement with each other and really try to work through our differences and try to find some kind of common ground. And so for that, I think bridging divides is essential, right? And so if we can't talk to each other about our common ground, if we can't plot a path forward for our country or build community resources by going to the same baseball games and community centers, right? That's a problem for our society and for ourselves, right? We alienate our family members, we lose our social capital. And so I think it matters a ton when it comes to interacting with each other that we can have the kind of skills and courage to talk across differences, whether those views come from ourselves or come from our culture and our family. It doesn't matter because they're all held by us in the end. But I think it's important to do it, even if it doesn't mean sacrificing our convictions.
In that thought exercise, you said let's consider the reasonable, right? It feels like we have a tendency though to jump to the extremes, especially when we're talking in group, tribally, about the other. What has to happen to bridge that gap in our minds? To set the extreme aside, label it as the extreme, and consider the reasonable, to use your words. What has to happen there?
It's a good question. I mean, the simple psychology is that you could just tell people that they're wrong. There's a misconception here. And there's lots of studies that show that we do make misconceptions. We are mistaken about the other side. We think the other side hates us, our side. They don't. The other side usually doesn't even care about politics to the same extent that you think they do. Most people, there's this report out from an organization called More in Common.
Mm-hmm.
You can tell what they're all about based on their name.
Yeah.
And they argue that 84% of people, I think, are part of the exhausted majority.
Yep.
They don't care about politics. They just want an economy that works, politicians that, clear the debt ceiling when it comes up, and just, make America work. And so we overestimate how many people care about politics, how many people hate us. We overestimate the extremity of other people's beliefs. The average Republican is not like give every toddler a gun and make 10-year-olds have babies, and the average Democrat is not like, let's give shrooms to, every teenager and make religion, illegal or whatever.
Right.
Those stereotypes are.
Right.
But the problem is like you can correct those misconceptions, and it actually has a measurable impact on people's attitudes and their willingness to interact with each other on a short scale. So if I'm about to talk to someone on the other side, and you tell me, "Hey, Kurt, they don't hate you," and in fact, they're pretty similar to you on many things, I'll say, "Great," and we'll have a better conversation. But then a day later, I'm on Twitter. I see someone terrible posting something terrible, and I get all worked up again, and then I forget that thing that you showed me, that the other side doesn't hate me, and I again assume that they do. And so we need to correct people's misconceptions, but then there's the higher level question of how do we design our media environments and our political structures to encourage the most extreme voices not be the loudest, to encourage politicians not to profit from fighting. And I'm not a political or political scientist, So I can't speak to that in a lot of detail, but I think we need to do the psychology, but also do the structural questions.
Yeah, that's a different topic for a different day and perhaps a different
Yeah,
guest. Uh, okay, so let's take an issue that I'm very familiar with in and what we're seeing a lot in the business space right now. Companies dealing with, I'll say, less or declining revenues, still profitable, revenues declining, and laying off, in some cases, multiple thousands of people, as we've seen from companies like Disney, for instance. I work at a very small company. We're only about 25 people, but we run under a concept called employee supremacy, where everything is done in benefit to the employees first, with the thought that it will benefit the shareholders down the road. Very different from what we call shareholder supremacy. We think and believe and hold deeply that that is a better way to do business, even in a capitalistic society. And if I want to change someone's mind to come along who might be in that, well, we lay off employees to balance the ledger sheet and we put people's jobs on the line. If I want to bring about change, if I feel there is a moral imperative even to bring about change, what are the conditions that have to happen or have to be in place for change, the change that I want to occur?
yeah. I mean, that's the question that everyone wants to know the answer to, right? How do you convince the other side? And it's really hard to convince the other side, right? So there's a whole literature on persuasion that I am not an expert on, right? That gets at questions of, do you have to be like deep, like get into people's like statistics and their reasoning? It leads to a better society. Do you just have to be superficial and show people like your employees like drinking beer out of jeeps with attractive people, right? Like you sell light beer. Um, I mean, my work on this stuff is about how can you get people to civilly engage with others.
Yeah.
And what we find is that people overestimate how much facts will matter
Hmm.
when it comes to engaging across these differences. So let's say you're talking to a staunch capitalist who thinks like shareholder value is going to help everything, right? Like a rising tide raises all boats. And the boats we should really care about are, corporate shareholders who own all sorts of stocks. Um, you can convince them with statistics, right? Like these are employee dominated companies or even co-ops, I think, which have this kind of flavor as well. And here's how well they do overall. But the human mind, to go back to the kind of myths of evolution, is not made for processing statistics. We are a storytelling species.
Yeah.
And so the way to do it is to talk about stories, in particular personal experiences. So really the most compelling way to do it is if you said, once I worked at Meta, and it was terrible. And I had to, shovel ad word revenue. I don't know what they do, what manual labor they do
You're
at
mixing
Meta.
up companies, Meta and Google there, but go ahead.
That's right. You can tell I'm not in the tech space. Um, and now you're like, I'm at this company, and like let me show you my own personal experience and how it differs, right?
Yeah.
Like I used to have the infinity symbol branded onto my neck by Zuckerberg, but now it's a land of milk and honey. And so I think if you share those personal experiences, someone can't contradict and say, well, those are just stats you made up, right? There's something like unimpeachable about your own experience. Even if it's just one story, right? We can acknowledge that it's true. And so personal stories have power.
For you personally, as you've gotten into studying morality and the mind and our deepest held beliefs, what's something that you've changed your mind about, or something that you have learned something about that perhaps earlier in your career you didn't believe it, you didn't know about it? Is there anything that comes to mind?
I mean, I don't know if there's any particular issues, But growing up, I was never involved in politics. I grew up in Alberta, which is like, I don't know, Canada's answer to Texas.
Okay.
There's like oil, beef, conservatism. I had a good friend growing up who was highly involved in the kind of like most right wing party in Canada, which is still probably left of the Republicans. I don't know, on a number of issues. But I found myself going into academia, and social psychology is definitely generally progressive because of its emphasis on like systems and context rather than kind of individual agency. But then I started, talking a lot with libertarians, doing a lot of work with kind of like right of center folks, and found myself kind of always somewhere between kind of like very progressive social psychologists and right of center funders and other scholars that I interacted with. And so I, I'm not sure there was any particular view that I've changed on as much as I find myself continually, in the middle. I don't know if it's under tension. It might seem that way from the outside, but just kind of acknowledging the kind of humanity of folks on the both sides. And sometimes that could be criticized as both sidesism. And I think it's fair to criticize it when one side is truly unreasonable.
Mm.
But I think when people have reasonable opinions and they're fundamentally good people, it, it makes sense to recognize the humanity in both of them. And so that's what I've kind of am continually confronted with, as folks from both sides kind of like rip on the other side for being silly or callous or, and just to kind of always sit with this idea that like, well, actually, people on the other side are reasonable people.
You've just got me thinking so much, Kurt, here about like people would come back to, well, what is your definition of a good person? Um, that's going to muddy the waters too. If you truly believe that that person's moral values make them a bad person, how do we overcome that in our minds?
So I think, and this is something I touch on in the book I just finished, right? I think you need to recognize that there's like two levels in a sense, right? We've got a common shared moral sense. Everyone has it. We all try to protect those that we care about from harm. I should say 99% of people have it. There are psychopaths in the world. Yeah.
Right.
And so I think it's fine not to be fans with American Psycho, kind of Patrick Bateman kind of thing, right? Like throwing chainsaws down stairwells at sex workers. You do not deserve a seat at the table, right? As an American Psycho. But I think 99% of people do care deeply about protecting those they love and the countries they love and the society they love from harm. The reason that we lose sight of that deep shared moral ground is because people make different assumptions about who is most vulnerable to harm and who needs to be protected.
Mm.
And those are not in themselves moral assumptions. Those are assumptions about how the world works, about kind of like the connection between our values and the real world, right? So think about abortion. We all agree that babies should be protected from harm. Like no one is aborting a 2-year-old, even if sometimes parents really, think that that might be a great option. No one says that that's a reasonable idea. But where they differ is on this kind of assumption about the world and how it works, which is that there is a life inherent in cells, or there's not, right? And maybe they emphasize what the cells will become in a blastocyst or a fetus, right? But they have these different assumptions about whether a fetus is a person or not. And based on that assumption, you get these moral differences. But the moral differences are not about morality per se, in the sense that like we all care about protecting from harm, right? We just make a different assumption.
Right.
And of course, there's legitimate moral disagreement about abortion, but like there's still this good core within each of us that cares about protecting those we love from harm.
What do you want people to understand about the work that you do?
Well, I think we've hit on two things that I want people to understand. One is that other minds are ultimately inaccessible to us. And so we shouldn't be quick to make assumptions about how someone else is feeling, right? And what that means is that we should be motivated to understand what is hidden behind someone else's face, in a sense, their mind, right? And so I direct the Center for the Science of Moral Understanding, and the understanding part is crucial to that because we need to ask questions, we need to reach out, we need to, you know, study what people are thinking and feeling and how they're coming to their world, right? When you come to a conversation with someone you disagree with, you should ask questions about how they arrived at their beliefs, as you did to me. How did you get here? Why do you think this belief is reasonable, right? It's not, and not an argument, right? It's like a way, a quest for mutual understanding. So that's the understanding part. And then the second part is the moral part, right? Moral understanding. You need to recognize that other people share the same moral mind as you do. And there's other theories out there, popular theories, that argue that liberals and conservatives have these different moral bases, right? Our minds are divided, and we disagree about kind of what values we moralize. I think that's not true. The science doesn't support that view.
Hmm.
I think we all have the same moral mind. It's ultimately grounded in protecting people we care about from harm. And we make assumptions about how the world works, and that concern about harm transforms itself differently based on our culture and our politics. But ultimately, we have the same moral, basis. And then by asking questions, trying to understand each other, we can come to moral understanding, right? Recognize the morality in each of us, and give each other the benefit of the doubt when moral disagreements or conflict come up.
Kurt, I don't know if you've realized this, but you've just made the case for my show here. So thank you. If anybody ever asks what my show is about, I'm just going to play your answer right there. That was phenomenal. Um, before I ask you my last question, I want to go back to another question that I wrote down for you. As you were talking, you said you got in this work because you were certain of one thing, that you didn't like rocks. And a lot of what you've talked about is, I'll characterize it as being comfortable with some level of uncertainty about other people. And in your answer right there, digging in to try and understand those pockets of uncertainty. Is there anything that you are certain of?
Yeah, I think so. I'm certain about the general goodness of other human beings.
Mm.
I mean, and I think that is an assumption and a conviction that I hold, that I think other people might not always. And it's increasingly difficult in the kind of media atmosphere that we're in.
Yeah.
But I think ultimately other people are good people, and we shouldn't lose sight of that. And social psychology argues that, the kind of structures that we're embedded in, and the kind of processes that make us stick together into groups, can kind of subvert those perceptions and send us down the path of darkness. But there's always, something deep within us that can be redeemed. And this is not a crazy idea, even if it seems like it in modern society. I mean, you know I'm sure you grew up in a religious household, and this is the core conviction of many religions, including Christianity, right? Like,
Right.
we can all be saved, we can all be redeemed. I don't think you need to find Christ to do it, but I think if we need to recognize that each of us, are fundamentally capable of sin, but each of us are fundamentally, worthy people of love, and that there's some inner goodness there that we can harness. And so my one conviction is that people are generally good, but also can do shitty things, right? Let's be
Yeah.
honest, right? But beneath that, right, there is a heart of goodness,
And my goodness, how different might your actions and your worldview look if you believed the opposite of that, right? So,
right?
yeah, I appreciate that perspective. Final question for you here. What is a question that you wish you were asked more?
Oh boy. Where can I find your upcoming book? I don't know. Um, I'm bad with these questions. Every time I'm asked, like, what's your favorite question? I just think, the world is too full of possibilities to have a question. So I think there must be a universe of question that I want to be asked more, because ultimately it's turtles all the way down.
I can't let you get off. I got to do a follow-up question. I can't let you get off with that. What is an aspect of your work that you feel is overlooked, is not talked about enough?
Hmm. Um, I, I mean, there's something I published a lot on some time ago that I think it's having an impact on the field, but I think it could have more impact on the field, and it's something called moral typecasting, and it's this idea that we put people into bins in our moral world, and we see them either as villains or victims, and that kind of tension between thinking someone as the perpetrator of harm versus a victim of harm really shapes how we make sense of our moral world. And so I think that is a phenomenon that can explain a lot of things when we are coming to moral disagreement, and that can exacerbate moral conflicts, right? Like how you feel like the innocent victim in moral conflict and think that the other side is like the scheming villain trying to destroy you and your way of life, right? Like those are caricatures that often come up, but I think it connects to a lot of moral conflict, and so I think that's one phenomena that I write about a little bit in this kind of new book, but also I think is important for understanding a lot of our arguments.
How do we set that typecasting aside? Is that possible? Like, how do we become more aware of our tendency to do that?
It's hard because it's kind of deeply ingrained within us. I think all I can hope for is that people can move off the kind of expectation that they're like 100% the victim and the other side is 100% the villain, to even just like a 98%, 95%, you know, like just by acknowledging, and this is, personal relationships too, or at work, right? If you just acknowledge, look, I may be a little bit responsible for what might be happening. And the person on the other side, who I'm thinking of as a villain, they might actually be authentically saddened and feeling upset by what's happening. Just that little recognition, right? That like a moral conflict is more complex than I'm the pure victim and they're the pure villain. I think that is hopefully enough of a seed to encourage people to talk more about things and reveal, our shared moral mind, that we can both feel harm and so forth. So just to nudge us off 100% certainty is all I can hope for.
I love that. I've phrased that before as, if there is a chance that you could be wrong and you could admit that, wouldn't you want to know the things that you could be wrong about? Like, wouldn't you want to go explore, where might I be wrong? If there's that chance, where could you dig in a little bit deeper? Kurt, I have loved this. Thank you so, so very much. I will make sure that at the point where the book comes out, when does the book release, by the way?
Hey, it'll be a while. It'll probably be like a year.
Okay, well, at that point, I'll make sure to get it out to my listeners as well, so they can check it out. But thank you so very much. I appreciate it, and best wishes to you. Okay.
Great. Thanks so much. Thanks for having me.
So many thanks to Dr. Kurt Gray for sharing his story and perspective on the show this week. Please do me and Kurt a huge favor. Share this episode with someone you know who might find some value in listening to our conversation. Please share this episode with your network. Share it on social media. Help spread the good word about the importance of asking more questions. And if you like the conversations with the amazing guests like Kurt that I have on each and every episode, subscribe so that you never miss when a new episode drops. If you ever want to get in touch with me, you can always email me at michael@thefollowupquestion.com, or you can go to michaelashford.com and reach out there. I'll catch you on the next episode of The Follow-Up Question. And until then, keep asking questions.